what we were doing, we were looking at two nonlinear spaces. Let me specifically write the norms as X norm and the Y norm, and we are looking at bounded linear transformations from F to Y. So F is a bounded linear transformation from X to Y with those norms. Okay. And then we found that a priori F has to be 1 1 and on 2 to define F inverse. Okay. F inverse as a map from Y with this norm to X, this norm. And once we had 1 1 and on 2, the inverse which is defined is automatically forced to be linear. Okay. Then if F were 1 1 and on 2, then the linearity of F forces linearity on F inverse. The question that we were investigating was whether the boundedness of F forces boundedness of F infinity. So we are looking at whether boundedness of F forces boundedness on F inverse. This was the question that we were looking at, and we looked at two examples last time. Okay, so we looked at two examples. The first example in which we considered X as C01 and the norm as norm of any function as the maximum, which we call as the infinity norm. Okay, maximum of xt between 0 and 1. And then we looked at Y to be the differentiable functions which vanish at the origin, and again we looked at the norm of Y as the same sup norm only. In both the cases we take the maximum norm, but the domain space is the set of all continuous functions and the codomain space is the set of all differentiable function vanishing at origin. Then this was example 2, I think. Okay. Then we had this defined as f of x at any point t is integral 0 to t x u du. Okay. And we found that it is 1 1, it is onto, it is linear, it is bounded, the inverse is linear but not bounded. Okay. So we found, this was found last time. Okay. We found that 1 f is bounded, linear, 1 1 and on 2, but f inverse is only linear but not bounded. So thus we see that the boundedness of f had no effect on the boundedness of f inverse, that were refused to be bounded. So the boundedness of f did not force boundedness of on f inverse in this example. Okay. On the other hand, we had one more example, which that was the first example I looked at, the example 1, in which I took x to be C01 and the norm x to be again the sup norm and y also to be C01 and the norm in y also the same norm, and then I defined f from x to y as f of x at any point t is e to the power of t x of t. And we found this was 1 onto bounded linear, and the inverse was also linear and bounded. So we found 1 f is 1 onto linear bounded and f inverse also linear. Of course, f inverse will also be 1 and onto. If this is 1 onto, that will also be 1 onto. The important thing is that it was linear and bounded. Therefore, in this case, the boundedness on f inverse has been forced. Okay. So there are two examples, conflicting verdict it gives. One example suggests that the boundedness may not be forced. The other example is some situation must be there where the boundedness is forced. Let's look at another striking example, very interesting, simple but clever example. Before the example 3 is the following. Now I am looking at continuous function because that's the simplest non-trivial infinite dimensional space I am looking at, when all others are almost like finite dimensional. What I am going to do is I am going to take x as again C01. I will take C101. What is C101? Continuously differentiable functions on 01. And I will take y also as continuously differentiable functions on 01. So I am going to take both x and y to be the same vector spaces. What I am going to do is I am going to use two different norms on these two places. Okay. So on x I will use this norm now. If a vector, if a thing is in C101, it means it is continuous and it is differentiable and the derivative is also continuous. So since x is continuous, I can look at its maximum norm, and since x prime is continuous, I can also look at its maximum norm. I will not write, simply write this. Since x prime is also continuous, I can look at its maximum norm also, and I will add these two quantities and define a new norm. That's a norm. Okay, you can verify that it satisfies all those axioms very trivially. Okay, so now what I am going to do is I am going to take the strength of x and x prime together. Okay, previously I was looking only at the maximum of x. To that I am going to add the maximum of x prime also to get the norm. But on the other side, as the norm for y, I will use only the maximum of x. Okay. So the vector spaces are the same, but the norms have been changed. So as vector spaces they are same, but as non-linear spaces those two are different. Now I am going to define, so consider this map. F mapping now this mapping takes these vectors into these vectors. So I must convert a C101 vector to another, or a C101 function to another C10 function. The easiest way to do is don't code. Take the identity function, identity map. That is as the identity transform. That is f of x, it takes the function x to x itself. Nothing changes. But what will change? The coded length will be different. The original length is that, but now the coded length is different. So actually the length that is being coded, not the vector. So the vector remains the same, but the length got coded into different thing. So now I am looking at these two spaces C101, and I have defined two different norms and taken the identity map. So let me draw the picture again so that we know what we are calculating. Here is C01, here is C01, here I have the x norm, here I have the y norm, and any function x goes to itself there. Okay, so this x is f of x. So the f maps x to itself. Now we have to see all the things. Of course it is linear because it is the same thing, addition is preserved. Identity transformation on vector spaces is linear transformation. So it is linear. Identity is 1 1, different things are taken to different things. So that's very obvious, and it's on to. Everybody sees his own image. So clearly f is linear and 1 1 and on to. So that part is no problem at all. Now we have to see whether it is bounded. How do I see whether it is bounded? I have to see the changed length to the original length, that ratio, whether that ratio is under control. Okay. So what is the changed length? For any x, the changed length is its length in the y space. But f of x is x itself, so it is the y norm of x. Okay. But what is the y norm of f? What is the norm we have chosen on y? Simply the sup norm. So it is equal to the maximum norm. But this is less than or equal to, if I add some positive quantity, certainly there will be less than or equal to an additional thing added to it. So therefore what do we get? First of all, norm of fx in the y space is less than or equal to the infinite norm of x plus the infinite norm of x prime. But what is the infinite norm of x plus the infinite norm of x prime? That's precisely the original length. So that says the fx y norm is less than or equal to the x norm. And therefore, what do you get? The changed norm cannot exceed the original length. So therefore, it works within an elastic limit of 1. So hence, f is bounded, and in fact, as a transformation, its norm cannot be more than 1, because the changed length to the original length maximum, the supremum, will be at most 1. It is always less than or equal to 1. So the supremum is also less than or equal to 1. In fact, we can even do a little better and show that it is indeed equal to 1. But that's not our problem now. So therefore, f is bounded linear. In fact, you can write in fact it is equal to 1, but that's an exercise. Therefore, f, hence f is 1 1 onto bounded linear. And now therefore inverse exists because 1 1 onto, and linearity forces linearity. So therefore the only thing that we have to investigate is whether boundedness forces boundedness. So okay, so f inverse is linear 1 1 onto, of course. So what about boundedness? So what, how do I, first of all, what is f inverse? F inverse must map what does it do? It also doesn't do anything, because if the code takes x to x, decoding is y to y, that's all. Every y is decoded as y itself. So f inverse of y is y itself. So now we have to see whether now the changed length, which is f inverse y, to the original length, which is y, is under control. Suppose f inverse is bounded. Now I am going to claim f inverse is not bounded. Claim f inverse is not bounded. Suppose f inverse is bounded. Suppose I would have given the same argument like last time, but when I was walking back after the lecture, I saw some couple of people discussing about that example where I get x to the power of n and calculating and things like that. So I thought probably that argument didn't go through, so I will put the same thing in a different language. Okay. Suppose f inverse is bounded, then there exists a constant m greater than or equal to 0 such that the changed length, where is the changed length? F inverse of y will be in the x space. So the changed length means x length is less than or equal to m times the original length. Where is the original length? In the y space, right? So if f inverse were bounded, then there must be a constant such that this happens. We will show that this leads to a contradiction. Therefore our assumption that f inverse is bounded will be false. Okay. So now m is a constant, m is a real constant, m is a real positive constant. Given any positive constant, there is a positive integer bigger than that. Give me 147.899, I will take 148. Okay, so therefore whatever positive m was there must be a positive integer bigger than m. So let m be a positive integer such that m is bigger than m. That is always possible, because once there is this m exists, I will find an n which is bigger than that m. Okay. So now consider what is this? This is for every y in y. Okay, that's what is meant by. Now consider this function y of t is equal to t to the power of n. Does it belong to capital Y? What is capital Y? It is space of all continuously differentiable functions. Certainly this is continuously differentiable. It is a polynomial. It is continuous, and this derivative is also a polynomial, and therefore it is continuous. So this belongs to y, and we will show that this violates this. Okay, so let's call this a star, and we will show this function will actually violate star, whereas star should have been true for all y. So what is f inverse of y? Again t to the power of n, because f inverse is also the identity map. So what is the x norm of f inverse of y? It is the x norm of the infinite norm plus the infinite norm of the derivative, which is n t to the power of n minus 1. Is the problem? Okay. So it's nf to the power of nt to the power of n minus 1. The norm, the maximum of this is 1 and the maximum of that is n, because t to the power of n at the point n equal to 1, t equal to 1, its maximum is reached as n. So the changed length is that. Okay. This is certainly greater than n. 1 plus n is certainly greater than n. But n is greater than m. The way we have chosen, n is greater than m. But m can be written as m times 1. But 1 is precisely the infinite norm of this. Therefore, norm f inverse of y, the x norm, is greater than m times the infinite norm of y. 1 is basically the maximum of the function y we have chosen. And therefore, norm f inverse y of the x norm is strictly greater than the y norm, and which is contradicting star. Contradicts star. Therefore, f cannot be bounded. Okay. So here is a very peculiar example. It is simply doing no coding. It takes x to x. It's only the metric that has been changed, and that killed the boundedness of f. The same map through the same spaces, but with different measuring concepts, and that killed the boundedness. On one way it was bounded, and the other way it was not bounded. So there you see that boundedness is not that easy. Even doing nothing, just the metric could destroy that boundedness. So the question therefore is, we have got now 3 examples. In one of the examples everything worked out nicely, boundedness of the inverse was also obtained, but in the other 2 examples something went wrong. Okay. Particularly the third example shows that the norm plays a very crucial role. I mean, it's going to decide many very crucial. You did not change the space, you did not do any coding. All simple thing that you did was to use 2 different norms, and that screwed up things. Okay. What then will make f inverse bounded? Okay. It looks like even if I just don't do anything, things don't work. Okay. So therefore, the theorem, one of the theorem that tells us at least under what conditions will this f inverse always be bounded. If I have a 1-1 onto linear transformation which is bounded, so if I have 1-1 onto bounded linear transformation, under what condition the inverse inverse is automatically bounded, automatically linear, automatically 1-1, automatically onto, the only doubt is boundedness, and that is that is the more probably a better version of the open mapping theorem that is often used. Okay. So what I will do is, I will just state the open mapping theorem, I will not prove it. So therefore, first if you look at the first example, in the first example I had C01 and C01, and the function x was changed to e to the t into xt. So there the important thing was not necessarily C01, but the important thing was the domain was a Banach space. It was a complete metric space, and the codomain was also a complete metric space. It was a Banach space. Whereas the other two examples, one of them was not, at least one of them was not a Banach space. So the theorem is that if both the domain and codomain are Banach spaces, and if f is a 1-1 onto bounded linear transformation, then the inverse is automatically bounded. That is when it is forced. Okay. So first of all, I will write it in the format that is known as the open mapping theorem. Okay. The open mapping theorem says that if x and y are Banach spaces. What I mean is by Banach space is the norm introduces, it is complete with respect to this. Every Cauchy sequence has a limit. That is what is meant by Banach space. So Banach spaces, then and if f mapping x to y is a bounded linear 1-1 onto transformation, then the open mapping theorem states, the name comes from this, okay, because it is stated like that. The name, it maps open sets to open sets. If you take any open set in the X space and look at its image, that will be an open set in the image space. So let me state it in that form. Then F is an open map. That's why it's called open map. That is, if G is an open set in X, implies f of G, its image, is an open set in image space. Okay. So in general, if you have a transformation, it need not take open sets to open sets. But if you had two Banach spaces, and if you had a 1-1 onto linear transformation bounded, then the inverse, then it must take open sets to open sets. Now, what does this got to do with what we were discussing? So, okay. So, what does it mean? See, when you talk of continuity, if you have a function from between two metric spaces or even two topological spaces, then we say that it's a continuous function if the inverse image of a open set is open. So recall. This recall is very interesting. Somewhere you would have heard that, okay? Or I might have myself done it. So in general, if I will put it H mapping X to Y is the function from one, normally I am dealing only with non-linear spaces. You could also take metric spaces or take these as topological spaces, but for us this is said to be continuous. I have defined this at the second or third lecture in August group, after when it started in August. Is said to be continuous if H inverse of what shall I call it, O, H inverse of S is, okay, let me put it this way, S open set in Y implies F inverse of S open set in X. Now there is a warning here. The inverse here, that first of all, forget about, there is no F, okay, that is H. Now forget about all those linear transformation that we are talking about. I am just looking at general function from one nonlinear space to another nonlinear space. There I was talking about, when I was talking about linear transform, the F inverse of an element. Now I am talking about H inverse of a set. These two should be distinguished. An abuse of notation, okay, very bad notation I would say. Somehow or the other it had got stuck, okay. By analysts are generally careful about notations, but here there was a mess. So I should make sure H inverse of S means, so this is X, this is Y, so H goes this way, S is a subset of Y, H inverse of S means all those elements in X which drop into S through the function H. So it is all those elements X in X such that H of X goes and drops in S. It's something like X is a post office, H is a postman, and that's another, that's some area in that city, and then all those letters dropped in that neighborhood is those letters which are dropped in that neighborhood. There may be somebody who never got a letter, but that neighborhood in which that letters are all dropped. Okay, one fellow may get all the letters, the other fellow in this S may not get any letter, but I am looking at all those letters which are delivered to S, that's all, to that neighborhood. Okay, that is what is meant by H inverse of S. Okay, so with that meaning, with keeping that in mind, what does this theorem say? F inverse is continuous. F is, it says open sets are taken to open sets. Now look at what is happening. So let us go back to open mapping theorem. I will call it OMT. Okay. Then what it says is, here is Y, here is X. Now F inverse is a mapping going from this side to this side. It is 1 1 and on 2, therefore there is an inverse that is going that side. And what can I say about, if I take, when is F inverse continuous? If F inverse of S is open in where? I'm sorry. Okay, let me make it even specific. Let us take H to be F inverse. Now apply that definition. H to be F inverse and apply that definition. So H is continuous. Now this is what H is. H is going now from this side to that side. So H is continuous whenever you take an open set in the range space or the codomain space. That is, if the codomain space is, so G is open in X, implies what? H inverse of G is open in Y. That's the definition. Now because H is F inverse, what becomes to H inverse? H inverse becomes F itself because I have 1 1 on 2. So this means F of G is open in Y. But that's precisely what the open mapping theorem says. It takes open sets to open sets. So what the open mapping theorem says is the inverse is a continuous function. So that's how, yeah. Where?
G open and Y implies.
No, because H is going this side. See, this fellow goes here and that fellow goes there. Do you understand? These two fellows have been flipped because H inverse takes Y to X. Look at the figures carefully. Okay? H goes from here to here, therefore H is continuous if the inverse image of this is an open set here, whenever there is an open set there. Okay? Look at that carefully. So basically, therefore, what the open mapping theorem says is, under this condition the inverse map is continuous. But then the inverse map is linear. And we saw for linear maps, continuity and boundedness are synonymous, and therefore the inverse map is bounded. So that version is called the bounded inverse theorem. Okay, both all are same. Okay, so therefore the open mapping theorem says, hence OMT says if F is bounded linear 1 1 on 2, then F inverse is continuous and hence bounded because linear. Okay. So therefore we can change the statement of the theorem as, if F maps X to X is 1 1 bounded linear 1 1 on 2, then the inverse is also bounded. So therefore we can state the open mapping theorem as bounded inverse theorem. That is X, X, Y, Y Banach spaces, F mapping X, X to Y, Y bounded linear 1 1 on 2, all this imply F inverse is bounded. That's forced now. How that's forced? That's what the condition. If you are working in Banach spaces, then just like 1 1 on 2, the linearity of F was forced on it, forced the linearity and inverse. The boundedness of F forces boundedness of F inverse. So, okay, so that's why it's always comfortable to work with Banach spaces. Okay. Well, we have seen examples where if one of them is Banach spaces, it will not work. So this is a sufficient condition. If that is not valid, sometimes maybe it is true, sometimes it is not true. We cannot definitely say that it will not work. Okay. For example, if you take two incomplete space, they take an incomplete space, okay, and take the identity map on itself with the same norm on both sides. So both are not Banach spaces. You have the identity which works within the elastic limit of 1. The inverse also works within the elastic limit of 1, so it's continuous. So both are not Banach. In fact, with a vengeance we can make both non-Banach and still work. So therefore, what is important is when both are Banach, it will definitely work. When one of them is not Banach, sometimes it may work, sometimes it may not work. Okay. So one of the things that you learn from here is, it's always comfortable and convenient that you work with a Banach space. I mean, your situation is nice if we can pose the problem in a nice Banach space setup. And we will soon learn that it is even more comfortable if that Banach space is a Hilbert space. So it's the first level of looking at problems which the least difficulties, many of the peripheral difficulties are removed. You go to the core levels of looking at the proofs, just look at Hilbert spaces. Okay. Now before I go to the Hilbert spaces, now that it just occurred to me that since I am talking about inverses, let me go back to situations where we were comfortable with inverses, namely matrix theory. Okay. So let us look at in matrix theory, let's get to the situation of these eigenvalues and eigenvectors. That is seems to be the one that tells everything about the matrix is controlled by this eigenvalues and or characteristic values and characteristic vectors. Whether you want to diagonalize, whether you want to find the singular value decomposition, whether we want to look at the principal component analysis, whatever you want to do, finally these eigenvalues and come into the picture. So, or if you are trying to do classical mechanics and you are trying to, or mechanics, and you are trying to look at a system which is oscillating around an equilibrium point, small oscillations, then it boils down to again looking at the frequencies of the normal modes of vibrations, which turns out to be the eigenvalues of some matrix. So it's all about these eigenvalues, which that is why they are called characteristic values. They are so they capture the characteristics of the matrix. So what are these eigenvalues? So for simplicity, let us take complex matrices where everything is easy to roots or problems are not there. So let us take A to be a complex n by n matrix. Just for discussion, we could work with RNN and do all these things, but always take a simple generic example. Start with. Suppose I take a complex n by n matrix, then I say lambda, a complex number, is an eigenvalue of A if, okay, let's see, when do we say it's an eigenvalue? You may say the determinant of A minus lambda I is equal to 0. But then if I put that language, a determinant, carrying it to the general case, I don't know what is meant by determinant. So I will avoid that. So I have to put it in some other language. Well, the simplest language is that there is a solution for Ax equal to lambda x. There is a non-trivial solution for Ax equal to lambda x. There is no problem about stating it in any setup. So therefore, if there exists a non-zero vector x in Cn such that Ax equal to the 0 vector. Now this immediately says that A cannot be 1 1. Oh, I'm sorry, absolutely. A minus, I'll put it as A minus lambda I x equal to theta. This immediately tells me that the matrix treated as a transformation from the n vectors to the n vectors cannot be 1 1, because two different vectors are going to 0 vectors. Namely, the x vector is also taken to the x is a non-zero vector. This non-zero vectors go to the 0 vector, and the 0 vector automatically goes to the 0 vector. So two vectors are focusing on the 0 vector, so it cannot be 1 1. On the reverse side, if it were not 1 1, what will happen? There will be two vectors which will be going to the same thing, and therefore the difference will go to 0, and the difference will be non-zero vector. So therefore, this means if and only if, that is if and only if A minus lambda I is not 1 1. If and only if A minus lambda I is not 1. I will also state it in other various possible. This is essentially then boiling down to if and only if A minus lambda I inverse does not exist. Okay, various ways of looking at this eigenvalue. The lambda is an eigenvalue if A minus lambda is not 1 1, If A minus lambda, the inverse does not exist, determinant of A minus lambda is not equal to 0. These two are useful for us. This language can be used anywhere, whereas the determinant language is difficult to use other places. We don't know what it means. So basically, therefore, what we are trying to capture as an eigenvalue are those places which create problem for defining the inverse of A minus lambda I. Okay, so the lambda, so therefore the eigenvalue set is equal to the set of all lambdas such that A minus lambda I inverse does not exist. Now basically this problem comes, the inverse question comes from various considerations. If you have a simple differential equation which is time variable and x variable, you get rid of the time variable by Laplace transform, then basically therefore it becomes a minus si y equal to this, where A is the differentiation coefficient of the differentiation matrix. So basically these are all boiling down to solving some problems and time dependent problems where the time variables got rid of by means of the space the lambda variable, the Laplace transform variable, and then we are trying to look at the other thing. Okay. So let me put it that way. Very simply, all of you would have seen some differential systems of differential equations with constant coefficients, etc., etc. Okay. Now, if you look at, for example, for a matrix A, if you look at very classical mechanics where you introduce the generalized coordinates, etc., then the kinetic energy is written as a quadratic form in the generalized coordinates, and the eigenvalues of those quadratic forms are precisely these lambdas we are looking for, and those eigenvalues are give the frequency spectrum for the normal modes of vibration. That is why this is also called the spectrum of the matrix A. Okay. So sometimes this is called the spectrum of A. It is because of the connection with the frequency spectrum and the vibration problems. Okay. Now what we want to do is look at a similar situation in a general Banach space. So I have two Banach spaces. I have a Banach space. So in place of Cn, the vectors which were in Cn, I am taking a Banach space, and in place of a matrix transformation, I am taking a transformation there. The matrix was linear transformation, so I want this also to be linear transformation. But what I will do now is, because I have this additional norm, I will take it as a bounded linear transformation. So F, a bounded linear transformation. Okay, so that means F belongs to the space of all bounded linear operator. This is a bounded linear operator. Okay, if this is a transformation from the same space to the other, we will call it a bounded linear operator. Now just like I look at A minus lambda I and see where are all the problems that inverse difficulty comes. Now when I want to define inverse of F minus lambda I not only want it to be linear, but I want it to be bounded. So I will look at all these points lambda in C. I will take these to be complex Banach spaces. Okay, so I will take it the field to be complex. You can do it on real also, there is nothing wrong. So wherever I wrote C, change it to R. I am going to look at all those complex numbers for which the inverse cannot be defined as a bounded linear operator. Cannot be defined as a bounded linear operator. Just like in the matrix case, because the moment the inverse exists, everything is bounded in finite dimensional space, there is no problem, the boundedness is guaranteed, only finite number of coordinates are there. So in this case there may be some problems, as we saw that the boundedness of f may not force any boundedness on the f inverse, the inverse. So therefore we would like to see those numbers where this problem occurs. Those numbers will be now called the spectrum of f. And it is denoted by sigma f, the spectrum of f. Okay. So the spectrum of f is some collection of complex numbers. Okay. It's some collection of complex numbers. Those numbers for which there is problem defining f minus lambda i's inverse as a bounded linear operator. Is that clear? It's just exactly copying what I did in matrix theory. Now I am going to look at this very carefully. So I want to, first of all, let me even forget about defining bounded linear etc. I want to first of all even define inverse. If I have to define inverse, it has to be first 1 1. Okay, that's what happened in matrix theory. And what happened in matrix theory was, the moment I got out of that not 1 1, it became 1 1. It was also onto, because in finite dimensional spaces operators 1 1 automatically implies onto. Everything is taken care of the moment I come out of those lambdas. So therefore I have to first look at those lambdas for which f minus lambda I is not 1 1. So one possibility is, look at this set, the set of all lambda for which f minus lambda I is not 1 1. All these lambda belonging to A are in sigma f. Because those places definitely I can't even define inverse, leave alone bounded inverse. Okay, so that's one place. This is precisely what, this is the only thing that happens in matrix theory. Nothing else happens. But now when you go to a general Banach space, many other things will happen. Okay, alright. So suppose we come out of this. I will, this is called P sigma of f. Or let me call it a sigma p. I will tell you what it means. Unfortunately, this is again misanticipated, wrongly anticipated terminology. Okay, so therefore I will not use that terminology completely, only use the suffix sigma pf. Okay, all those lambdas for which, not this is all those lambdas for which lambda f minus lambda I is not 1 1, that we will denote by sigma pf. Certainly sigma pf is part of sigma f, right. Now let us look at a lambda in C such that it is not in sigma pf. Yeah, all those points. Now what does that mean? F minus lambda I will be 1 1, that is guaranteed. So therefore, hence f minus lambda I is 1 1. F minus lambda I, yeah. It will become clear, because there are fellows, they see in the 1 1ness may be the problem, disease. Not being 1 1ness may be the disease, because of which the inverse is not possible to define. Okay, but he may not have the 1 1ness problem. He is still 1 1, but he may fail to be onto. See, in the finite dimensional case, 1 1 and onto were synonymous. The moment it was 1 1, he was also onto, etc., etc. But now he is 1 1, but he may still be not onto. and therefore those points are a different set of points than this sigma p, for which still inverse problem exists. So that is another part of the spectrum. See, the spectrum consists of all those points where there is trouble. The trouble may be because you have liver problem or heart problem or brain problem. So we are going to separate all these problems. This is the simplest problem. It is not one. At the beginning stage itself you have problem. Okay. So I took your blood pressure, it shows 340 by 190. So immediately I admit you in the ICU. Okay. But now your blood pressure is okay. It is 1. But then I may make more checks. Okay. Are you on to how is your heart? Okay. So it may say that even though lambda is outside this, it is 1, but still we may have problem about defining f minus lambda I inverse, because f minus lambda I may not be onto. Okay. So I look at all those points. Okay. So now I call that as sigma f minus sigma pf is all those points lambda in C such that f minus lambda I is 1, but f minus lambda I is not onto. What happens to the other points other than these two sets? The moment it is 1 and onto, open mapping theorem says the inverse is bounded. So therefore those points cannot be in the spectrum. The spectrum consists of all those points for which the f minus lambda I inverse cannot be defined as a bounded operator. The moment it is not 1, you can define. The moment it is 1 but not onto, you can't define. But the moment it is 1 and onto, open mapping theorem says you can define. Okay. That is why I wrote this as sigma f minus sigma pf, because that's all that spectrum will consist of. If lambda belongs to sigma f complement, then f minus lambda I is 1 and onto, and therefore f minus lambda I inverse is bounded by open mapping theorem, OMT. That's why I wanted to state that. And therefore that's the other set. Okay. Sigma f complement is called what shall I say, RF. Okay. RF is the set of complex numbers for which sigma minus lambda I inverse exists as a continuous inverse. Okay. So what we have is, there the complex plane. In the complex plane there is one portion called sigma p, then there is another portion called, which consists of, okay, let me write this. One portion consists of all those lambdas such that f minus lambda I not 1. Another portion which consists of lambda f minus lambda I 1 but not onto. The remaining portion is where f minus lambda I is 1 and onto, and therefore the open mapping theorem f minus lambda I is a bounded inverse. So the remaining portion, this is the portion where f minus lambda I is 1 1 and onto, and therefore by open mapping theorem implies f minus lambda I inverse is bounded. Okay. So the places where problems can arise are those two places where it is not 1 1 or 1 1 but not onto. If it is both, no problem. Open mapping theorem says you don't have to worry. Okay. So the spectrum consists of two pieces. One piece where there is trouble because it is not 1 1. Another piece it's trouble because it is 1 1 but not onto. We're clear? Right. Now we will later see because that this will also be divided into two portions. Okay, it's two separate portions. When it is not onto, what can happen? What sort of problems will be there when it fails to be onto? When it fails to be onto, what does it mean? F minus lambda I is not going to fill up the whole space. So it's going to leave gap. How much gap is left? Either too much trouble or less trouble. By how much does it fail to be onto? Okay, that's the question we will investigate. Now basically, why do I need all these things? Okay, suppose I'll just make one comment. Suppose I want to solve a equation like this. Given y in the Banach space, find x. Okay, this is like the simple matrix equation a minus lambda x equal to y. I am trying to invert. Okay, so basically, therefore, I would like to write x as f minus lambda I inverse y, and therefore I am saying what are all these lambda that are going to create trouble. Okay, what are all the lambda that are going to create trouble? Now I said I want bounded. Why am I so particular that the inverse is bounded? Why am I so fussy? Okay, the reason is I may not know why exactly. I may be doing some approximations, and therefore that y that I am putting in there may not be accurate, and therefore I don't want small errors in my measurement of y to reflect as big errors in the solution, which means I want it to be continuous or bounded. That's why I want it to be bounded. Otherwise my whole problem approximation businesses will totally fail. That is why I want that to be bounded. Okay, that is the reason why bound. And now you will see that in the suppose this was a matrix, okay, and I am trying to solve this system. The places, the numbers lambda for which there will be real trouble are the eigenvalues. Okay, and there will be eigenvectors connected to this, and these very same fellows who created trouble will give me the eigenvector through which I will find the solution whenever the solution exists. The troublesome fellows are also helpful fellows. If you view properly, there is good in everything. Okay, that lambda, which was a troublesome fellow, provides me an eigenvector, and if I collect all the eigenvectors suitably, then that tells me how to solve the system whenever there is a solution, and whenever there is no solution, it also tells me how to find the least square solution. Okay, so basically, therefore, bad fellows can be utilized for good things. Okay, same way, when you solve this system in a general Banach space, the points in the spectrum are the ones which are the bad points, and utilizing them we can find the solutions. Okay, the bad points will help you also to find the solutions. In other words, for example, when I am doing a contour integration, the bad points are the places where there are poles, singularities. But those very bad points give me the residues from which I calculate the integral itself. Because see, the bad points also have good information. Okay. And that's what this spectrum is all about. It is exactly modeled on the eigenvalues of the matrices, but in the case of infinite dimensional nonlinear spaces, there is much more trouble that may arise than in matrix case. In matrix case, only eigenvalues, otherwise invertible. Whereas in the infinite dimensional cases, eigenvalues may be one part which may create problems. Also, there must be problem because of one-oneness but not onto-ness, which did not happen in the finite dimensional case because one and onto were synonymous. This is a very important theorem. The innocuous looking rank nullity theorem is a very simple innocuous looking theorem which is very powerful. Okay, it forces one-oneness equal to onto for linear operators. So therefore, the spectrum is the one of the most fundamental things while we are studying equations, solving partial differential equation, ordinary differential equation, integral equation, integral differential equation, differential algebraic systems, all of them will eventually boil down to looking at eigenvalues of some operators. Okay, or I mean the spectrum of some operators. Okay, of course the easiest operators are those which behave exactly like matrix. That is, that other problem does not arise. Only the one-oneness problem is there, all other system is working okay for him. That fellow has only one disease. So basically modeling that is what is known as the compact operator theory. Okay. So therefore, these are the various versions where we look at this matrix theory, how we carry it over. Okay. And in order to look at it even at very simple situations, first level, we will in the matrix we talk about orthogonal eigenvectors for symmetric matrices. So this notion of orthogonality has to come, which means I must have a dot product, that means inner product, and I want Banach spaces, so I will get into the notion of Hilbert spaces. So the next chapter I will take up is Hilbert spaces. Before that, I will tell you how we want to divide this part into two pieces. When it is not onto, what sort of troubles that may arise, why it may fail to be onto, how badly it may be onto. Some cases where it is not that badly onto, we can still handle. It is only the question of this really badly onto, it doesn't allow you, then we have trouble. So we will look at all those cases and then we will go to the theory of Hilbert spaces, which is what probably one must learn first level thoroughly, the Hilbert spaces, then try to learn what if I don't have an inner product. So I get into Banach space. Then what if I did not have completeness, then I have a general nonlinear space, and so on. So first look at, as Polya says, if you don't know how to solve a problem, first look at the simplest version of the problem which you might not have still solved. So we will boil down to this lowest level of the problem at the Hilbert space level, understand this, then we will know what will happen. We can guess what will happen in the general case. So the next chapter I will start is the Hilbert spaces chapter, inner product spaces and Hilbert spaces. Okay.